If you were here last week, after we celebrated Priscilla's ordination on Saturday and then installed me as senior pastor on Sunday, it was very beautiful that one of the gifts Priscilla offered on your behalf was a replica poster from a John Coltrane tour. Not that I am besotted with John Coltrane, or that, unbeknownst even to Priscilla, that tour poster is for a show that I have a live recording of, which made it extra fun. So how could I not work John Coltrane into my first sermon as the senior pastor here? Starting with the first reading. This is by the poet Ellen Bass, and it's called "During the Pandemic, I listened to the July 26, 1965 Juan Lepin's recording of A Love Supreme. The first familiar know them anywhere notes bless me this savage morning. Coltrane's horn racing up and down every alley, in and out of veins and over the faces of lakes and into the heart of stones. And when he repeats a love supreme again and again, it's as though if he says it enough, he can ease that mercy down into me, into the tiny ossicular chain, the chemical rush, the spark, and my brain getting it, if even just for this 32 minutes and 48 seconds. My daughter's been sick 7 weeks with the virus. Yesterday she felt a little bored, she texted. And I grabbed that like a shopping cart. I load it up with hope. Make it prayer. When the day's portion of Torah is recited, someone stands by to correct mistakes. The words must vibrate precisely in the air. So I open my door to the breath of his instrument that refuses nothing, lavishing the grass, gutters and trees, concrete cars, the gopher pulling down the new lettuces. This generous sound that can mean anything, nothing, whatever you need. And isn't that God? Isn't that it? This shivering, this fall to my knees, gods do walk among us. But humans are, after all, a broken promise. And yet these humans seem to be trying to enter what? I can almost hear it. This old planet, worms passing through their passing earth through their tissue, orchids, corn, mockingbirds throwing themselves into song like there's no tomorrow in a body. He's telling me I'm alive in a beach town in California, and my daughter in a high-rise in Vancouver, my girl lying feverish on the couch she's been lying on 49 days and 49 nights, still alive. The Bible reading for this morning is from Acts. It's a short little story. It starts with very early church stories. Peter has been traveling around, and it starts in a town called Joppa. Now, in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. In English, both of those mean gazelle. I don't know if that's a significant plot point, but it's a great detail. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time, she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, Lydda was the town where Peter was visiting, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." And she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and the widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. That's the story. Did I mention that I'm going to talk about John Coltrane again? Sorry. It was a heartwarming experience for me last fall when the news broke that they had found a long-rumored recording of a live recording of A Love Supreme. When several of you forwarded the story to me to make sure I had seen the news. You know me, you really know me, or perhaps more ominously, I bore you to tears by talking about the saxophonist that I like to think of as the other JC. I'll take that risk. A Love Supreme live in Seattle was an amazing find because it captured a rare live performance of an album that was monumental as soon as it was released. The album was a four-part suite that was as much a theological statement as it was a musical one. But even in the studio, Coltrane was restless with it. They recorded the whole album, just the quartet, his classic quartet. They recorded the whole thing in a single day, but they came back for a second day because Coltrane wanted to play around with adding some additional musicians, a second saxophonist, a second bassist. He never released those takes. And on the only live recording that existed prior to this Seattle one, which is the one that the poem talks about, it was just those four brilliant players. But in Seattle, he had extra musicians with him. There was his saxophone, of course, and he had Elvin Jones on drums, McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on the bass. But he also added the hotshot young guy, Farrell saxophone as a second tenor player. He added Donald Raphael Garrett as a second bassist, and Carlos Ward on alto sax, which is kind of fun because Carlos Ward was a local Seattle guy who they just invited to sit in the day of the concert. The guy who recorded it was a friend of Coltrane's who strung up 2 microphones dangling from the ceiling, so I guess twice as many microphones as we have in the middle of our room, hooked them up to a reel-to-reel player, recorded it, and hid them in his attic for 50 years. The tapes had been rumored but never heard, so they were recently discovered and restored. And when the CD arrived in the mail, I still get CDs in the mail, like some kind of weirdo. It felt like a holy relic. My first listen went a lot like these things tend to in my house. I put it on in the living room. I was trying to be very considerate of my wife, Kathy, who was in the kitchen. And she said, when it started up, she said, "Oh, you can put that in the kitchen speakers too." So I did. And then the music started to pick up and the sound expanded. And she said, "Oh, you don't have to leave that on in the kitchen." So I took it off, but I sat in the living room for the whole blessed hour of it. The closing strain of the final movement, which is called Psalm, kind of wrapped up. There was a slight pause before the 2 bassists started to play something else and then realized that maybe it was all done. One of them is on tape saying, "Oh, is it done?" And John Coltrane says, "It better be, baby, it better be," and just starts laughing. Kathy walked out into the living room, stunned and a bit mystified to find me with tears streaming down my cheeks. And what I like to imagine was a beatific smile on my face, but I'm sure was much messier looking than that. So she backed away slowly and left me to my moment of union with God. And then once I had collected myself and went out to the kitchen, she said, "I don't think I've ever been moved by a piece of music like that. I don't really get it. Is it the music itself, or is it the story behind it?" It's the story, isn't it? Well, how to explain that? Yes, it's both. The music doesn't exist without the story of the brilliant musician who nearly ran himself into the ground with a heroin addiction, and who might have flamed out, but managed to quit it cold turkey and burn brightly until his death. too young of liver cancer. Love Supreme was the musical expression of gratitude for a spiritual awakening that he'd had 7 years earlier. But it wasn't just the story that did that to me. It was also the stories I'd been reading in a book of interviews. It's called Coltrane on Coltrane. I had just learned about the time he was in a packed club and realized that the ticket taker at the door hadn't had a break for hours. So he left the other 3 players just playing on the stage, walked over and said, "They'll be fine for a while," sat down and collected tickets so the guy could go find a bathroom. Or the time when he walked into the back of a club to find the owner and the manager talking about how much money they'd taken in and realizing they didn't have enough to pay the band and also pay their staff for the night. The owner asked, "Who do you think could go without for a little while?" And Coltrane interrupted him and said, "You know what, I have to pay my band, but I'm good for a while. Why don't you take mine and give it to the staff?" So he was gentle and generous and curious. And with that miraculous album playing for the first time, I was shoulder to shoulder with fellow supplicants packed into a Seattle club in 1965, stitched across time to other people living under a cloud of stale cigarette smoke, ice clinking in glasses as we looked up at the microphones hanging from the ceiling, the musicians performing their alchemy underneath it all. McCoy Tyner's block chords, Elvin's powerful drumming, the 2 bassists figuring out how to have a dialogue between them inside a longer conversation, a hint of Coltrane's breath itself brushing my forehead from the bell of his Selmer Mark VI. So yeah, the music and the story it was, and I wept to be in the presence of a musical and spiritual genius who died 7 years before I was born. Which is maybe a bit of a strange way to reflect on a Bible story, but there you have it. I mean, let's be real, this Bible story that we heard, it's kind of a strange story in its own right, which just makes it one among many. There are a lot of meanings packed into a few short verses. And just as many questions. Like, we don't get Tabitha's voice in the story, so am I really all that far off when I imagine that her first words, this dynamo of a woman, that her first words after Peter wakes her up from being dead might have been, "Are you kidding me? I just got to sleep." I don't know. I'm fairly confident that at least one intention of the story is to say that the death-defying power of Jesus was passed along to the Jesus movement, the community of his followers. But for me at least, the resuscitation of Tabitha is the least interesting and important part of the story. Let's be honest, even if we read this as a literal resuscitation of death, from death, rather, we're reading it from a point in history of looking back, where Tabitha's body will have been returned to the soil several times over by now. Far more interesting, I think, is that even though there's a persistent assumption that disciple is a male noun, the story just starts with no fuss by saying there was a disciple named Tabitha, without any further need to editorialize on it. And it wraps up with a tossed-off line that says, "And Simon Peter stayed in town for a few days with a certain Simon who was a tanner," which means that he made himself the house guest of someone whose work made him socially suspect. This little story does big work of highlighting the powerful forms of community that the early Jesus movement created. Even more striking to me is the tenderness that Tabitha's death evokes. Her people washed her and placed her body in an upstairs room, and then they sent for the most prominent person they could think of to come and do, well, to do what exactly? The story doesn't really tell us. As far as I can tell, just to come and bear witness to a life that was well lived, which he does, Peter. He comes to see. And the widows, this is another important piece of the story that is just slipped in there. It was widows gathered around Tabitha. These were people whose status in the ancient world made them deeply, deeply vulnerable. They wanted more than anything to show off the clothing that Tabitha had made, to show their own care for her by bearing witness to the care she had offered others. The clothing that literally stitched their life and hers together. I can't help but notice that this Bible reading comes to us on Mother's Day and tells us a story about a woman who was decidedly not defined by her maternal identity. The story doesn't say anything about that one way or the other, so it doesn't, maybe we can say it doesn't force her to be a mother. Maybe it's worth just a small aside in the middle of this weird and frightening cultural and political moment to say from the pulpits to all of those whose bodies could potentially bear life, that I trust you to make decisions you need to make and would support you in doing that. And the story does not force Tabitha into motherhood, but instead eulogizes her and it revives her for her commitment to building community in which all people are cared for and all belong. That, to me, is the most powerful part of the story. Not the magic of raising someone from the dead who will again die at some point, giving another few spins around the sun, but the lasting power of building beloved community. The fabric and the stitches of the clothing she created are long unraveled, but her name, Tabitha or Dorcas, Gazelle, that graces a page of sacred text, and it graces the lips of everyone who reads it out loud. And it asks us and it invites us to think about, who do we want to be? How do we want to be remembered? It's an important question while the world seems to fall apart around us. Who will we be and how will we be remembered? What will last, if only for a while? An array of clothing made for vulnerable bodies, spirit blowing through a saxophone, and a determination to make sure that the night's workers are fairly paid. It takes a certain foolishness and temerity to believe in the good in spite of all the evidence to the contrary. But there is the story, the sacred story of Tabitha, and there are my tear-stained cheeks, and here is God's good news. Amen.